What do you do when it feels like your spiritual life is crumbling? When trusted leaders fail, doubts rise, grief hits, and you don't know what to believe in anymore? In her new book, Someone to Believe In, embracing the Saviour who stays the same when everything else changes, author and Bible teacher Courtney Reisig helps us to see Jesus' unshakable character. If you're not sure whether you believe in Jesus yet, or if your faith feels unsteady in the face of grieving, burnout, or disillusionment, this book invites you to encounter Jesus as the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Get your copy of Someone to Believe In today at someonetobelievein.com. My friend and fellow author Blair Lynn remembers the moment the floor dropped out beneath her. What followed were panic attacks, ER visits, and waves of anxiety so intense they left her trembling, breathless, and afraid she might die. As a Christian, she knew she should cast her cares on God, but she didn't know how. In the depths of fear and discouragement, simple answers and spiritual cliches fell flat. There was no quick fix, no bypassing the valley. In Made to Tremble, Blair shares how she learned to walk with God through her anxiety, not around it. With scripture, story, and raw honesty, she shows what it means to embrace our weakness, not as failure, but as the place where God meets us most tenderly. This is a book for anyone who feels overwhelmed, afraid, or unsure if faith can hold in the storm. Through Blair's story, discover the peace of God and a deeper awe of the God of peace. Get your copy at madetotremble.com. You guys are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast, and I'm here. I'm here with a cough, and also with a fellow Brit, Russell Cowburn. I've known of Russell and sort of interacted with him in various ways over several years, but we were just realising that we haven't actually met in person. So I'm delighted to see your face, sort of moving face, Russell, rather than just a sort of static impression of you. For those who don't know Russell, he is a professor of experimental physics at Cambridge University. His research interests there include nanotechnology and its application to magnetism, electronics, and optics. Russell, like me actually, did his undergrad, master's, and PhD at Cambridge, a wonderful place to be. And before returning to Cambridge in 2010, he held positions at the CNRS in Paris, at University of Durham, and Imperial College London. Russell is the founder of 3 startup companies and a fellow of the Royal Society. Russell, which college were you at for undergrad, master's, PhD?
I was at St John's College, although now as an academic there, I'm a fellow of Darwin College, so I've spanned 2 colleges in my time. Gosh,
this is really awkward because I did my undergrad, master's, and PhD at Trinity.
Oh dear.
And famously, for those who are not as aware of Cambridge College rivalries, at Trinity we have a saying, which is, I would rather be at Oxford than St John's. Which is basically, the most damning thing you could possibly say about another college. But gosh, I suppose we'll have to set aside our collegiate differences, Russell, on this occasion.
I think I can just about manage that.
You think you can manage it? Well,
I can, yes.
I appreciate your graciousness. I actually last summer had the great pleasure of going back to Cambridge and speaking at an event at St Andrew the Great Church, where I attended all through the 7 years I was there, and I was able to take my best friend Rachel Gilson, who some listeners to the podcast will have heard me chatting with her about various things. And it was hosted in part by a guy who is doing a PhD at St John's. And so he said, okay, I'm going to give you this tour of St John's. And I said, well, okay, that's fine. Like, we can do the tour of St John's as a starting point, like before we do the tour of Trinity, just so that Rachel can see how much better Trinity is than St John's. And so we did this little tour of St John's, and then I took Rachel over to Trinity, and half of Great Court, which is the beautiful sort of centerpiece of Trinity College, Cambridge, was under scaffolding. And then the incredible, beautiful, ancient sort of dining room of Trinity was literally like a third smaller than it was meant to be, because it had scaffolding, and then they like faked the walls to make it look like... Anyway, I'm basically still grieving this, but Russell, you can be smiling and chortling and feeling smug in your Johannine brief moment of superiority, but it's not going to last. This is not at all what I wanted to talk to you about. But Russell, I think many people would honestly be surprised to hear that somebody who is a professor of experimental physics at Cambridge University is also a serious follower of Jesus. So do you want to maybe just start by telling us kind of how you came to be a Christian in the first place?
Sure. So I was brought up in a church-going family, but looking back, I would probably say now that I didn't have a personal faith. And it was really when I left home, first to do an internship, a gap year before then going on to Cambridge, that was the first time that I'd really encountered the Bible and Jesus in the Bible. And even though I'd been going to church for most of my life up to that point, I immediately saw this was something new. This was something different. And that was really, for me, the start. I became a Christian that year, just before going up to Cambridge. And of course, what's interesting there is that was the beginning of my life as a Christian, but it was also the beginning of my life as a professional physicist, because I was going to university to study science. So really, for me, being a Christian and being a scientist have both been running hand in hand for my entire adult life.
How interesting. Russell, one of my favorite quotes from you, which I think maybe is from a talk you gave several years ago, but I've used it many times in writings and sort of speakings of my own, is you said something like this: understanding more of science doesn't make God smaller. It allows us to see his creative activity in more detail. So I'm curious how you kind of reached that conclusion. I think in many people's minds, the idea that God created the world and that he is, somehow in charge of things, the more we understand of science, the kind of less credible that becomes. But it seems like you have a different view. So maybe give us a quick two-penny worth on that.
I mean, I think that comes from, its starting point is a mistake that we call the God of the gaps mistake. And it's the idea that God is the bit of the universe that we don't understand. So whenever we see something that science can't explain, we're tempted to say, oh, well, that must be God responsible for that. And that implies that God isn't responsible for all the bits that we can explain. And of course, if you start with that God of the gaps mistake, then every time science takes a step forward, then God takes a step backwards, because science has expanded its footprint. It now explains more of the universe, and therefore there are fewer unexplained bits that we call God. But as I say, I think that's a mistake. That's not the starting point. I turn it around. I say God is the creator and author of everything, and science is observing and understanding all those things that he has made. And so every time science takes a step forward, we actually see a little bit more clearly of what God has done. So God actually gets bigger as science goes forward.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think one of the things I was reflecting on with another guest 1 or 2 episodes ago was the impression sometimes people have that as we've understood how vast the universe is, that has made Christianity seem sort of less credible. As in, the argument that sort of says, well, you may be convinced by Christianity, or people once upon a time could be convinced by Christianity when they thought that we humans were sort of at the center of the universe and that our Earth was kind of at the center of all the things. And now we understand actually we're like one teeny tiny planet orbiting a insignificant sun as part of one of billions of galaxies, and this sort of scale of the universe makes Christianity less credible. I'm curious how you would respond to that idea from a scientific perspective and as a Christian.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly see where that's coming from, but I think there are lots of counter-arguments. I mean, for a start, to be honest, at this stage of science, we don't actually know how special we are. It is possible that we are the only sentient species in the entire universe. We haven't found life on other planets yet. So if it does turn out that we are the only species, then actually that is a truly remarkable thing, that this enormous universe, this thing that is so much bigger than we ever thought, and yet we hold a special place in it. That is still a possibility. It may not be true, but science hasn't decided yet. It's something that science may come to a view on in the next few decades, because we're just beginning to explore exoplanets and places that potentially could host life outside of our solar system. But I think, that idea that you talk about looking at the vastness of the universe and saying, how can humans be in any sort of special relationship with a creator God. I mean, that is an idea that's in the Bible. There's one of the Psalms in the Bible, the hymn book of the Bible, if you like, that asks that very question. It says, what is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him? And then it remarkably says, even though there's this enormous universe where we appear to be so insignificant, despite that, the remarkable thing is that God has chosen us to have relationship with. So I think actually that makes the Christian claim even more remarkable. It actually bolsters it rather than diluting it.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I guess it's hard for us as finite beings to wrap our minds around the infinity of God. The Bible's claim is that God is sort of vast and extraordinary beyond our wildest imaginings. And there's an extent to which the more we can sort of see of the vastness of the universe, it sort of helps to expand our imaginations a little bit toward.
It does, absolutely.
Toward God.
Yeah. I mean, you'll be aware that in part of the Old Testament, there's Abraham, as he became, is invited to count the stars. And I think it says, as if anybody could ever do that. Now, from a modern science perspective, we know that with the human eye, with no telescope or anything like that, you can see about 4,000 stars in the sky. So yes, that is a large number, but with the help of a telescope, we now know that number is billions and billions and billions, that the number you can see with the naked eye is tiny compared to the number that are actually there. And again, this gets us to just how remarkable science is, that we've now got instruments that allow us to see those billions of stars in a way that we couldn't see them even 100 years ago.
Gosh, that's interesting. I never actually thought of that particular thread, because if Abraham, he's being promised descendants that would outnumber the stars, and if he can sort of see 4,000 at that point, that would have seemed like an awful lot of descendants for Abraham, once upon a time in the ancient Near East. Now, I mean, by any reasonable calculation, there are billions of Christians around the world, and we also can see billions of stars. Sort of almost like our kind of frames of reference are expanding in both directions.
That's right.
But Russell, so imagine somebody said, well, that's all very nice and interesting, but the sheer claim that there is a God who made this universe in the first place seems at odds with the discoveries of science. I mean, there are certainly have been sort of prominent scientists and popular science writers in recent decades who've argued that actually we've understood now enough about the origins of the universe itself to realize that we don't need God. There was no need for somebody to sort of light the blue touch paper, as I think Stephen Hawking put it in one of his books. So how would you respond to somebody who said, listen, fine that you believe in God, but I, as a scientist, have an alternative explanation to the origins of the universe that eliminates the need for that hypothesis?
Well, I mean, I think, again, a lot of these arguments end up sounding reasonable but they sound reasonable, but actually they're built on a fundamentally flawed premise, a fundamentally flawed starting point. And I think in what you've said there are two mistakes. I mean, one of them is to think that the Christian view of a creator God is limited to what we call origins. So just the start of the universe, that moment of Big Bang. And the idea of God lighting the touch paper is sort of very characteristic of that God got it started and then science took over from there. But I don't think that's a particularly Christian view of the way God interacts with the universe. The Christian view is that he is more immanent than that. He is intimately involved in the everyday running, if you like. I mean, the New Testament talks about that in Jesus, all things hold together. So, I don't want to separate God from the ongoing running of the universe and just leave him at the starting point. But I think also the other mistake in that way of looking at the world is to assume that science and a Christian view are somehow competing explanations, and that we somehow have to choose which one looks more reasonable. Because if we do that, then science has got a lot of wins to its name. It works. It's got a wonderful predictive property that we can test with experiment. And in that sense, science works really well. And if we make the mistake of saying, well, if science works well, that means there can't be a God, then I can sort of understand the argument. But I don't think we have to say that. I think there is space to say, yes, science works really well, and there is a creator God who is responsible for all of it, and that all science has done is just described more clearly both those initial actions in origin and the ongoing actions in sustaining the universe that God makes.
So I think some people might push back on that and say, yeah, but the basis of science, the sort of foundation of the scientific method, is to eliminate sort of divine intervention. You don't form a hypothesis and then think, oh, well, we'll do an experiment and we'll sort of have as a potential answer to our experimental questions that, God intervened with a miracle. Or we're sort of eliminating the supernatural from the process as a foundational plank for science. So isn't that a pointer toward atheism of saying, well, if science works so well and it's founded on non-belief in God, sort of functionally, doesn't that point to atheism rather than towards theism?
Well, yeah, I know what you mean, but in science, what we do is for the day-to-day working of science, you're quite right. We try to avoid any sort of supernatural or miraculous explanations. I think the technical phrase is methodological naturalism, which is a wonderful mouthful, but it essentially means that for the purposes of our day jobs as scientists, we will act as if there is no God. We won't invoke God as an explanation. I think where the mistake is made is that people take that sort of working protocol, that methodological naturalism, and they say that actually reflects the reality, that therefore, because science works, therefore there is no God. But actually, that's not quite right. It was really just to say this limited activity that we do, that we call science, works best if we don't use the method. If we don't use God as a method within it. But that doesn't mean to say that there is no God. It just means for the purpose of science's day-to-day activity, we don't draw upon God as an explanation. I think another way to look at it is there are different layers of explanation, like a hierarchy of explanations. And science is concerned with that sort of lower level hierarchy about the nuts and bolts, the day-to-day mechanisms. But science doesn't really address the next level up questions about why is this stuff here? Who put it there? It's much more involved with the lower technical details. Another way I've often thought about this, which I found very helpful, is to think about the difference between a house and a home. So an architect or an engineer can describe a house, and we'll talk in terms of size of bricks and thickness of gap in the double glazing and colours of doors and angle of roof. And that's sort of the scientific realm. And yet we all know that if that's the only thing in our minds when we think about a house, we've completely missed the whole dimension of home, about the relationships, about the reasons we live there, the people we know, the history we've shared. And those are more in the sort of the theological realm. And to be honest, engineers and architects don't have much to contribute to that. They're more about the nuts and bolts.
I love that. As somebody married to an engineer, I will certainly be quoting you on that engineers don't have much to contribute to the home.
Well, in a personal capacity they do, but not in a
yes.
not in a professional sense.
So you and I were chatting a little bit before we pressed record about the origins of what we now think of as science and some of the kind of pioneers of the scientific method. And I'd love for listeners to hear a little of your thoughts on that, sort of some of the heroes of the scientific revolution who would, like, yourself, be serious followers of Jesus.
I mean, my undoubted hero physicist is James Clerk Maxwell. He's the founder of electromagnetism and field theory. And without him, the world would look very different scientifically. His contribution was enormous. He was also the first Cavendish professor in Cambridge. So historically, he's very important. And he was a man of profound Christian faith. And for him, there was no problem. I doubt it crossed his mind, to be honest, that he would have to explain how he could hold these two things together. In his worldview, it was just so natural. And to the point that when he established the first physics department in the University of Cambridge, the Cavendish Laboratory, he insisted that a sign be put up above the door in Latin, but which translates to great are the works of the Lord. They are sought out by those who delight therein, which is, again, is a quote from the Bible. And, he didn't believe that everybody in the building had any form of faith, or that not everybody had faith. But what he did believe was that the work that went on in the physics department was the exploration of the works of the Lord. And that's pretty much how I see it. So he's a great inspiration to me. I'm a terrible chemist. As a scientist, it's my biggest failure. I wish I were a better chemist because there were some really fun things I could do. But the father of modern chemistry is a man called Robert Boyle. And, he is undoubtedly the greatest of all time. And he also was a man of profound Christian faith. We could talk about Michael Faraday. The list goes on. It was just such a natural thing to do. Perhaps the one that surprises a lot of people, though, is Charles Darwin. Now, although he lost his personal faith in later life, probably due to the death of his daughter, intellectually, he was absolutely clear that there was no problem with being a scientist and also being a person of faith. And in Cambridge, we have a library of all Charles Darwin's correspondence. And there's a letter in there where somebody wrote to him and said, "Dear Professor Darwin, I hear you've got these interesting ideas about the origin of species and biology. Does this mean that I can no longer believe in God?" And he wrote back and said, "The idea that you can't believe in God, but also be enthusiastic about my science is absurd." That was the word he used, absurd. It was just so natural to all of these people that science and faith were two sides of the same coin.
The Sing hymnal, from award-winning hymn writers Keith and Kristen Getty, is a rich collection of classic and contemporary hymns created to deepen worship, foster unity in the church, and proclaim the hope that we have in Christ. Alongside beloved hymns, you'll also find psalms paired with songs, liturgical readings, and helpful indices, making this hymnal a lasting resource for families and congregations alike. Pick up your copy wherever books are sold, or get 30% off at crossway.org/gettyhymnal with a free Crossway Plus account. One of the ways that I sometimes sort of try to explain to people who've heard only what we might call a kind of new atheist account of the history of science and faith, which is usually a kind of victory playlist of all the times that the brave non-theistic scientists, as it were, in the framework have overwhelmed the foolish Christians. I think it's fair to say that in every famous kind of controversy surrounding science and faith, whether it's sort of Galileo or the Big Bang or Charles Darwin, etc., you'll find serious Christians on both sides of the conversation. So it's not to say that there aren't real questions that Christians need to grapple with as they think about the relationship between science and scripture. But the Christians have been sort of arguing about these things for pretty much as long as we have any records. I mean, at least from St. Augustine in the 4th century, there were sort of debates about exactly how science and the sort of science of the day relates to our understanding of scripture. But rather than it just being a kind of brave atheist scientist defeats, foolish, evil church folk, as it were, the history of science it's much more often in the kind of Western world like as the Americans call it, an intramural debates. Not that there aren't. I mean, for sure, there have been and there absolutely are now, leading scientists who would consider themselves to be sort of firmly atheist in their beliefs. But one of the fun things I got to do over nearly a decade of working with Christian scientists at various institutions across the US and the UK was sort of meeting world-class scientists in every field that's supposed to have disproved or discredited the Christian faith, who are actually very serious Christians, sort of like yourself, Russell. Pivoting our conversation a little bit, we are coming up on Easter, obviously a central kind of celebration for Christians, the time when we celebrate what we, if we're followers of Jesus, believe was his death and burial and resurrection from the dead. And I think many people kind of listening to this podcast might think, Christianity has a nice set of ideas, maybe some good moral ideas, albeit some today would see some of Christians' sort of moral ideas as bad rather than good. But, nice story that you can tell yourself. But can you as a scientist seriously believe in a miracle like a man rising from the dead? Like, isn't the claim of Jesus' resurrection actually fundamentally against science? What would you say to somebody who was thinking that?
So within science, certainly within physics, the big competition, if you like, or the big rivalry is between theoreticians and experimentalists. And I'm, just as at the beginning we were joking about the rivalry between St. John's and Trinity, it's the same sort of thing. And I'm proudly an experimentalist.
Mm.
And what that means is that when a theoretician has an idea, that idea might hold together really well. It might be entirely self-consistent. Even so, the experimentalist would say, until you have demonstrated through experiment that that set of ideas actually matches the external reality that we live in, you're nowhere. There is no value in science to ideas that hold together in a self-consistent way, but which don't have that validation through experiment, which, that proves that they do accurately reflect the world we live in. So the external reality is the master in deciding what is right and wrong. So I think you're right that if Christianity were only a self-consistent set of ideas, that wouldn't be enough. At least it wouldn't be enough for me, because I'm such an ingrained experimental scientist. I need some validation that these ideas actually do reflect the reality of the world and the universe that we live in. And I think the Easter event, and in particular the resurrection of Jesus, is that key experiment. That is the moment when we find out, is Jesus just an inspired teacher, or is he, as Christians claim, God come in human form? Because it's only if God come in human form that the most fundamental law of nature, i.e., people die and don't come back from the dead, it's only if God is in Jesus that could possibly be broken. And again, I think the experimental method, or science in general, teaches us that when you have an experimental observation, if you believe it's solid, if you've done your experiment well, even if it's in complete contradiction to theory and to all of your understanding up to that point, then experiment wins. You've got to reevaluate your thinking. The one thing you can't do is to ignore an experimental observation because it doesn't fit with your theory. And so when people say Jesus can't have risen from the dead because we know dead people don't rise, therefore Christianity can't be true, that's got the logic entirely back to front. All we really know is that usually dead people don't come back to life. That is our observation of normal life, if you like. But when you've got somebody like Jesus who comes in and says, I'm different, I am God incarnate, if he then does something completely different, like if we find he's unable to be bound by death, I think at that point we've got to say we've got to reevaluate our model. We've got to trust the reality of what we've seen and what's been passed down to us by eyewitnesses, and we've got to change our understanding.
So what if somebody said, though, Russell, okay, we've got millions, billions, however many, pick your number of experimental data points saying that dead people don't rise. And then you have this claim made 2,000 years ago by a bunch of people we can't sort of interview today. We can't take a video camera and sit outside Jesus' tomb and see if the stone has been rolled away and if he comes out. We can't do sort of a scientific experiment to evaluate whether this happened or not. Wouldn't you as a scientist be more consistent to say, well, I'm going to trust all the other data points and say this is just one blip that, is probably a sort of false lead? Why would you not take that?
That's an interesting way to put it. I mean, I think, any good scientist at this point has to check the validity of the observation. So we need to say, well, what are the bits of evidence that Jesus rose from the dead? And I think there are enough different angles on it, including things like, it was in the political interest of the leaders of the day to produce the dead body. There's no explanation for why the disciples, who were very discouraged and were largely giving up, why they were suddenly emboldened such that, the message rang out of Jerusalem throughout the entire world. There are all sorts of observations that just don't work unless something as dramatic as Jesus rising actually did happen. So we've got to check the validity of the observation itself. But then we've got to compare it. We've got to say, is it consistent with what Jesus himself was teaching? And I mean, that was the thing that when I became a Christian that struck me most, was just the scale of the claims that Jesus was making. He just wasn't saying, here's how to be nice to each other. He wasn't yet another moral teacher. He really was making claims that before Abraham existed, he existed. Just these enormous claims. And so when you've got such huge claims matched with this extraordinary event, but well testified, to my mind, the reasonable thing to say is, well, actually, Jesus was telling the truth. He is who he claimed to be. He is God incarnate. He is the different one. He is that 1 in a billion exception.
What would you say if somebody said to you, okay, I understand that you believe in the resurrection, and it's totally fine. I respect your beliefs, and that's okay. And I'm not saying that you're wrong, but I'm just saying that I don't believe in the resurrection, and I think it's fine. Like, I think we can just agree to disagree, and it doesn't need to be a sort of right or wrong between us. Like, you can have Jesus, he can be true for you, and the resurrection and Easter can be true for you, but it doesn't have to make any claims on me.
Well, I mean, in terms of getting along with people and not fighting with everybody, you see that might be a reasonable approach. There are times when agree to differ is the more gracious approach. But in terms of actually getting at truth, I mean, this is one of the interesting things. If you look at sort of the modern philosophical environment we live in, where the idea that you can have your truth and I can have my truth, I mean, that's a very sort of modern philosophical way of looking at things. Interestingly, it's not a way that sits particularly comfortably with scientists. In scientific conferences, we don't talk to each other like that. We get on well. We find ways of interacting nicely and politely and warmly as human beings, but we recognize there is only actually one truth, and it's that truth which our scientific experimental work is trying to access. And the idea that something can be true for you but not true for me sits very, very strangely with most scientists. So in a sense, scientists are actually, from a philosophical point of view, we are better disposed to to dealing with these enormous claims of Jesus than many other people are.
You say that, and I know you and I know some other sort of professional scientists who are very serious followers of Jesus. But if you just look at the data on the proportion of professional scientists who identify as atheists versus members of the average population, there's a higher proportion of atheists in this. You're more likely to be an atheist if you're a sort of professional scientist than if you're an average person. So doesn't that point us in the direction of saying, okay, if scientists are serious about their truth claims and they wouldn't be comfortable saying, well, Jesus both sort of did and didn't rise from the dead, that the majority of your colleagues would land on the he didn't rise from the dead side, and therefore that's where those who kind of care about science should land as well. How would you respond to somebody who took that view?
I think I'd want to look at the statistics a little bit more carefully. I mean, all statistics need interrogating, and that's one of the things that science teaches you. I mean, the latest data that I've shown, as with all statistics, it depends how you ask the question, but it's just over 50% of certainly in America, of practicing scientists who have some form of belief. Now, that's belief defined in quite a broad way, from a personal belief in a creator God right through to a more general belief that there is some external power that we don't quite understand. But it's more than 50%. I think it's 51% that the latest data show. There are other surveys that compare belief amongst scientists from the beginning of the 20th century compared to the end of the 20th century, which is an important time span because that encompasses 2 world wars and an enormous change in general thinking about life. And actually, again, the numbers are fairly constant across there. It's about a third have a strong belief, about a third don't, and about a third aren't quite sure. So, I mean, there are other things you can interrogate. You can look at the proportion of senior scientists compared to junior scientists, all these sorts of things. But I think the take-home message from this is there are lots of scientists who find a way of making a strong belief work for them. It's not as if belief is a real oddity among scientists. Throughout my career, I've worked with people of faith, people of no faith, people who are Christian, people who are Muslim, a huge variety of opinion. And I think what worries me is that sometimes people outside of science have this view that those of us inside science are by default atheists. And that's just not true. That just doesn't match the data. That there are all sorts of beliefs amongst working scientists.
As we come up on the Easter season, I'm curious as you sort of think back over the years and decades that you've been a follower of Jesus, and that you've been sort of learning more and more about science, more and more about life, just in your kind of life experiences, whether the claims of Jesus sort of this Easter seem more compelling than they did a few decades ago when you first put your trust in Jesus, whether they whether you've sort of discovered more reasons to question them, sort of how the arc of your life, I guess, as a scientist and as a human being, as a Christian, has gone. Like, do you feel sort of more robust in your faith now that Jesus rose from the dead, or do you feel like there have been more things that have caused you to question that, even though you're still sort of holding on to that belief?
I mean, sometimes you hear people say that Christian faith stops you from thinking. You know, there's a meme of like sort of the inside of Homer Simpson's brain, where you see the donut section is the dominant part and all these sorts of things. There is a meme that shows a brain, and it's got the faith section, and it's like a little Pac-Man mouth. It's eating away at all of the rest of the brain.
Gosh.
That hasn't been my experience. I think I've thought more about philosophy and, you know, these bigger life questions because I've become a Christian than I would have done otherwise. So it certainly hasn't stopped me thinking about these things. And the older I get, the more I think about these things. I still think, you know, that what attracted me to Jesus in the first place, the scale of his claims, the authority with which he spoke, and the fact that the model that Christianity presents of a world that God made well, it was good, but which is turned in on itself, what Christians call sin, was just such a good explanation for the world that I saw around me. Interestingly, you know, there is a strand of thought that says humans are getting better and better. There's this idea of just perpetual progress. And maybe across a 10-year window, you can sustain that view. But the longer you live, the more you realize that it's hard to believe humans are getting better and better. And that fits very well because, you know, Jesus says, no, the fundamental problem is this curved in on ourselves, this desire to rebel against God, and that only he is the ultimate cure to that. He is the good physician for that terminal illness that all humans have. And I think the longer I've been a Christian and the longer I've looked at the world, I still think that matches the data that I see.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Russell. I hope you and your family have a wonderful Easter. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You guys have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can follow us on X or Instagram. You could leave a review on iTunes and maybe there mention a topic you'd like to see explored in a future episode. Between now and next week, if you are not a regular churchgoer, I would just really encourage you to maybe this Easter check out a local church, see whether the claims of Jesus become more kind of intriguing in the context of seeing others who are serious followers of Jesus, like Russell and I doing sort of strange things on Easter morning, like singing together about this man we believe rose from the dead. And if you are already a follower of Jesus, why not invite somebody to church this Easter in the last few days? I and several of my friends and family members have been inviting various people we've met in various contexts to Easter services, and I think we've been quite surprised by how many people have just said, yeah, I'd actually love to come and see what you guys are up to on Easter morning.